Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming back. Some of you might not know this, but basically we just used the webinar list from last time when Pete and I from Megaport did some chit chat about different ideas around connectivity and hybrid cloud. And today we've got a really special guest, Kyle Moreta from Megaport, who's a solutions architect. He's going to help me get a little bit more technical, start talking through some of these ideas in a real world. Hopefully some of you guys are doing real world things. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and kick it off. I do want to set the expectation. We are going to break the group up into two. I'm going to take a group. Kyle's going to take a group. I'll remind you of what's going to go on kind of in the middle of the presentation. Once you get there, like Devin said, if you have a question, feel free to unmute and chit chat. I'm going to stop a couple times. I'm going to ask everyone to use the reactions part of the Zoom meeting that you're in right now to do raise your hand based on kind of just some, polling questions, if you will, not real poll, but you know what I mean, like the prompting questions for everybody. And then we'll have the drawing, and I'll get right into that. So small group, better chance to win. So today we'll give away a $100 Amazon gift card at the end. Stay tuned at the end and I'll make that announcement as we go along. And so I wanted to make sure I set the stage. It's a little bit different context of what we talked about last time. And we're going to try to get practical with some of these ideas, right? The goal here is to identify the ways that you can achieve some of these hybrid cloud architectures, some of the tactical ways, and the work that you need to do before you can actually do the API or the clicky or whatever way you're going to implement some of these changes. And really, I think this, I was talking to the group yesterday, we were preparing for this chat, and ultimately the source, this HashiCorp State of the Cloud survey was done kind of last year, middle of last year, and they identified skill shortages as being like the #1 blocker to multi-cloud operationalization, hybrid cloud adoption, skill shortage. I think everybody on this call probably understands that it's worse now, right? And so I would expect that to be way worse. And I think the data points that are here, although not all related specifically to network hybridity or compute and application hybridity, they are key parts to what affects your ability to be efficient with these designs. Because I think one of the things, and Kyle, I don't know if you see this, but what we see a lot of is people want to adopt multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, and ultimately end up doing it super inefficiently, right? Like they just go haphazard. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right, Will. I think the biggest thing that I see customers doing, or the customers and companies that I work with, is, they started off with maybe their cloud journey, maybe an initiative got pushed down. Hey, we need to start migrating a few workloads over into GCP, for example. And so they set up these onesies and twosies that don't really plan for, expansion and moving into other clouds. And so the lift to start getting and playing around in these other cloud environments and getting them connected to your hybrid environment is a little bit more of a heavier lift and some other considerations in there. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, totally. I see certainly the public cloud adoption without any strategy is like an everyday thing, I think, at this point, right? Like we used to talk about it like shadow IT is buying cloud. And now it's like IT is buying cloud still in a completely haphazardly way, right? So
right. I feel like I hear, cloud first strategy, but actually like peeling back the layers on what that actually means and how to have a cloud first strategy initiative actually run smoothly. I feel like there's not as much guidance and there's not much more opaqueness to that.
Totally. So, before we get into like the how-tos, I think it's important to understand what needs to be thought about before you go to take this next step and push your business into this hybrid cloud or multi-cloud future. And if you are, and in technology, whether you're here as like an MSP consultant for others, or you're actually implementing these things yourself for your company, if you think that something you're going to do for your business is going to make them more efficient, save them money, identify a problem or identify a solution to a problem, you probably don't have enough foundational evidence for that theory unless you sit down and actually talk to the business, right? Because what they think the problem is might not be what you think the problem is. And even if your problem is valid, it might not be the top concern, right? And yeah, so I mean, I think it does start there. And then as you kind of migrate towards this beginning to implement, making decisions about, okay, the business has said we need to do this, these applications are critical, these applications are not critical, we're gonna, these have security concerns for us or not. You start to put together the pieces and you end up with these complex scenarios that arise, right? And Kyle, maybe you could riff a little bit on like this second point around applications and data gravity and what you see, like how people are choosing to place what in what locations.
Yeah, I think with as I kind of mentioned, with all these companies kind of having this cloud first strategy, just kind of haphazardly putting up these applications or maybe these storage buckets or S3 buckets and different types of object storage in the cloud. Maybe initially there's like, let's get it up there, let's do all this without actually thinking about where those end users are sitting. So where are the majority of the bulk of our users sitting? That's going to come into play for performance and ultimately like end user experience, right? If most of our end users are, say, sitting on the East Coast, maybe all of our AWS environment or all of our cloud environments are somewhere on the West Coast, those kind of considerations that customers don't really see, but maybe there isn't maybe it's not as high performance. Maybe they're okay with a little bit more latency in there as well. So, I think having the flexibility there or the agileness to be able to move around different regions based on the needs of the business and that ultimately where your end users or those people that are consuming these applications sit is one consideration that kind of gets overlooked from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, heck, let's talk about how much harder this has gotten since COVID, right? Like it used to be, well, my offices are here. That means my users are here. And that's not even the case anymore, right? And for a lot of larger businesses that don't have as much kind of tight controls, the SMBs tend to be, they kind of know a lot about you. Every employee is known, right? Like they know where they're sending your pay stub or your donate, like everybody knows it. But in larger businesses, people that took a job in the Bay Area might not live in the Bay Area anymore. They might have moved and they didn't really tell anybody, but they moved, right? And so, it's become even more complex. And now once you get there, you end up with a whole host of problems. I mean, it's identified here, bandwidth and egress charges. That's just one kind of thought process around what happens. One of the outcomes of getting to public cloud offerings is that you have these kind of bandwidth and egress charges that you never really saw because that application sat in a corporate data center or colo facility over a private line connection, because that's how people did things in the past. And it was just use as much as you can. There's no rating that 200 meg circuit between you and the data center. Now you get into public cloud and like every gigabyte's being charged for everything, right? Cross region, external, you name it, there's a charge for it. And it's not just that, right? Like people say another common one is leveraging storage subsystems in public cloud, right? They, whether that's S3 or EBS or Azure Blob or GCP disk, like it's not just storage. It's not just buying capacity and making sure there's enough pipes into your capacity. It's like every transaction, every time you touch the storage, every amount of throughput, every IOP, everything is being tracked. And sometimes it leads, the lack of understanding of the application prior to migration is the problem ultimately, right? You don't understand how complex that application was before you moved it. And then the coup de grace of this whole thing, which is like security and governance. It's like we have all these security things that we've done for 15 or 20 years in the client server model of traditional IT. And then we get to the public cloud, and like, certainly I'm not speaking towards the capability of the public cloud. There's capability out the wazoo for security, right? It's probably done a lot differently than what you do on-prem, but there's a lot of capability. The problem is people aren't educated on it and they don't implement it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, Kyle, right? Like, at least on the networking side, there's some security and privacy constructs to the stuff we're going to talk about today, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, like dealing with a lot of, especially in the highly regulated space, like I think the ones that there's so much, could be a lot more done, and like the customers just don't know, is in the government space, right? Being so highly regulatory and like understanding all of the compliance standards that pertains to your industry is pretty important to maintain, you know, these FIPS or ITAR compliances specifically for the government space, but also for PCI and HIPAA compliance as well.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. So let's get right to the problem, right? You know, you've done all these assessments. You begin to understand what you need to do. You understand you want to be inherently hybrid or multi-cloud. We're going to talk about probably this third thing, which is like hybrid plus multi-cloud, which is where people are ending up. but ultimately, you've recognized the challenges that face your business. You understand that this is going to likely make things more complex, but the assessment is that the business benefit is worth it, right? Maybe it's cost, access to platforms and services, agility, I guess cost, like CapEx savings versus OpEx expenditure. There's all kinds of things that you've recognized. When you start to look at the solutions that are available, it's probably slightly different than you think, right? Like the solution a lot of times isn't, okay, I'm just going to consume another service from this public cloud vendor that I chose, right? The solution is growing. The growing predominance of the solution is, I'm going to do this thing, that thing, and the other thing differently with this cloud provider, on-prem, this partner, etc., because that's what's ultimately going to solve for efficiency and cost optimization, right? I mean, I think that's where we're getting to. And I think, Kyle, maybe you could talk about that. We mentioned this, kind of remote branch SD-WAN idea. And I know we talked a little bit yesterday about, some of the complexities around SD-WAN even, which people have for the last 5 years been adopting like crazy, thinking that it's the panacea of connectivity.
Yeah. And, while I'm a big advocate for SD-WAN, nothing like breaks my heart more than when I see a company get involved in SD-WAN when maybe it wasn't the right solution for them, or maybe they weren't ready for all the technical challenges and the administrative overhead that kind of comes with that. I think one challenge that I always see, or one challenge that I come across more frequently than not, is when customers think, they think like, what, I'm only using Cisco Viptela. I'm never going to move over to another platform. I just have to become an expert in that. Then, the next month or the next quarter, their business or the company goes through an acquisition. And now maybe they're have to integrate and have this blended vendor SD-WAN solution, where maybe the business they acquired is using Versa SD-WAN, or maybe Aruba Silver Peak, and so going through and pigeonholing yourself inside of that can also be a lot of challenges too, when you're going through and trying to administer all of your different branch offices and cloud connectivity considerations with all these different vendors too.
Yeah, certainly. And, what I've noticed along those lines around SD-WAN is that a lot of these solutions still promote the idea of ubiquitous deployment of the SD-WAN solution. So a lot of the cost ultimately comes in, okay, I use Viptela. I need to make sure I have some Viptela capable device everywhere, whether that's a virtual machine or an appliance on-prem. And there's just got to be one everywhere, because that's how it works, right? And the reality is there are other options. There really are. And they are options that are somewhat more agnostic. At minimum, they're more friendly to multi SD-WAN players, right? Like Megaport's MVE solution. How many do you guys support now? Different SD-WAN appliances?
5 different vendors, I believe.
5, right.
Yeah.
And so getting all 5 of those vendors to ensure that they connect and have compliance with each other, not easy, right? That's not, also unlikely, I guess would be the better word. So definitely something to consider. Okay, well, we've reached the time of the presentation where we're going to break out into breakout rooms. We're going to talk through some of these diagrams of what Kyle and I see every single day. Please, 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 if you have a question or you want a clarification or you want to have a really quick chat about something you've seen, unmute and speak, right? Raise your hand if you want to first, and I'll try. If I recognize that, or Kyle recognizes that we're not in the middle of like a "tell me about this," raise your hand kind of question, I'll try to grab it and get you to unmute and come on in there. All right, so we're gonna break this up, and then we're gonna come back together after the breakout sessions, and we're gonna take another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll get you out of here and give you the $100 gift card.
Awesome. What I really like about this kind of initial first step, or this initial setup, is, you know, using an existing internet circuit or ISP or DIA access that you have can be very quick and easy to actually build out this connectivity over into these cloud providers. So once a customer actually goes through and decides, hey, we want to get connected to the cloud, honestly, I think the first logical approach is start playing around with a VPN. Just get those workloads connected, have a little bit of workload starting to run in there, but maybe you're not doing anything production wise, right? Once we start to have more production workloads inside the cloud providers, we just kind of start to see more egress fees and more fees just starting to be associated with it when you're starting to consume more cloud. So in my mind, this diagram is a good kind of first step and allows us to continue to build off of this for the rest of our deployments, and as those workloads in the cloud kind of start to mature, right? So when we think about the points of failure or what could be wrong with this architecture, right? At first, you know, we're going to have to fare the storms of the internet. We all know that the internet isn't always going to be the most reliable circuit for consistency, latency, and performance. But also, whenever we go through and build out that connectivity in each one of these cloud providers, the endpoints from where this origin is, this customer router that's actually peering with these CSPs, and these gateways that sit inside the cloud providers are largely kind of going to be where the points of failure sit in this setup, right? So if we just have a single VPN built out to each one, naturally, if it's only landing on a single VPN endpoint in each one of those cloud providers, that kind of leads its way for a single point of failure. So if one of those endpoints were to fail, go into scheduled maintenance, you know, you would ultimately lose that connectivity into the cloud providers. Now, one thing that I think I've seen a lot of cloud providers starting to do, and anyone here who has AWS or has an AWS VPN knows that they're starting to do a better job of offering resiliency and offering redundant VPNs into these different cloud providers as well. So if you have AWS and you only have a single tunnel, you probably start to notice inside of your AWS console, it's giving you a notification saying, hey, you only have one VPN set up. For redundancy, set up another one. Right. So once we have
a question, it looks like, from the group.
Oh, fantastic.
Not in chat, but he's raised his hand. It looks like you're Jay Hagg, H-A-G-G. J-H-A-G-G, if you want to unmute your line, or we'll just keep going. You've got your hand up, so. All right, sorry for breaking you, Kyle. We'll keep moving on.
All good, Catherine. So when we start to have our cloud journey mature, right, I think that's when it starts to get a little bit more, oops, let me go back over this one. Right now, we want to start looking over into getting a private line to these cloud providers, right? So what's really nice, and I think what's really well done, what the cloud providers have done with their offering and the way they handle the routing inside of their environments, is a lot of them automatically will start to prioritize privately learned routes over an AWS Direct Connect, Azure Express Route, GCP Interconnect over a VPN connection. So now our VPN connection that we had in the previous slide has moved over to our redundant circuit or over to our backup. So now our primary circuits are all using those private connectivity models. We're starting to see the savings on the egress size, and now we can start to play around with higher throughputs into the cloud providers as well. So with our VPNs, I think typically they're going to be capped at around 1.25 gigs of bandwidth that you can theoretically push through those. When we move over into this private connectivity models, that allows us to scale up and get actual dedicated bandwidth into these cloud environments. So maybe we're starting to move a lot more workloads back and forth from AWS to on-prem or into phoenixNAP's bare metal offering, right? So having a physical private line built out can offer a lot of advantages and can seamlessly, as a nice natural growth progression to a VPN to a private line, and can make it easier for failover and redundancy. Really, all we'd have to kind of do to ensure that we are starting to utilize these private lines for as our primary circuits is from our on-prem router. The considerations are going to be, using ASPath prepending and local preference to influence the inbound and outbound traffic. So it prefers the private lines as a primary, VPNs as a secondary. Then on the cloud provider side, a lot of that's already going to be baked into any routes that are being advertised over our direct connects, our express routes. Those private connections are just going to natively be more preferred. So a lot of the times from the cloud provider perspective, as soon as you bring up these private lines, the cloud provider is automatically going to start routing over it. So really the biggest consideration comes down to how that ends up being influenced from our on-prem. Now, quick show of hands, or feel free to come on the mic. What do you guys think about this setup? Do we think this is a viable setup in terms of having HA redundancy and using this VPN as a backup? And or if anyone also has this setup already in use, I think this is a pretty common one that I come across all the time. Awesome. So as we start to get really serious about our hybrid cloud strategy, I think that our networking landscape also kind of has to adopt and change to that as well. So in this model, and the reason why I have a service provider in here is not only because I work for Megaport and we are a direct connect, express route, and interconnect partner, but also because using a service provider allows us more easily to build out HA and redundancy when we're connecting to these cloud providers. So when we have a service provider like Megaport in the mix here, because they already have all these different on-ramps available and all these different connection points with the cloud, it makes it easy for us to deploy geographical redundancy across all of our clouds. So for example, if you guys can see close enough, I tried to make the colors of each cloud provider edge router a little bit different color to kind of indicate a primary or a secondary. And so maybe these AWS routers or Azure's or GCP routers sit inside of the same facility, but are landing on different upstream devices. So maybe they're mapped out to different devices. Maybe it could also be, hey, this circuit is going over to an on-ramp in the East Coast, maybe in Ashburn, Virginia. And maybe this one is more so being pulled back over to an on-ramp, say on the West Coast, to get that geographical disparity. Now, what I like about a model like this is when we have a failover, or I guess before I talk about a failover, right? So when we have a setup like this, what's unique and what it differs from when we have our VPN is it allows us to actually treat our primary and secondary as much more active. So now instead of having one set up for just a primary and the other one as a secondary or active standby type setup, we could actually start to leverage ECMP and load balance across all of these different links that we have. So in the case of a failover, you don't notice nearly as much performance impact during a failover, when you're experiencing a failover, when there's a point of failure in the setup, right? When we have this VPN type setup, whilst it will still provide that connectivity and all of those connection points, you're not going to end up getting the same level of performance out of this VPN as you would if the failover was going through another private line and leveraging these different on-ramps here. So in my mind, once we start to get really serious about our cloud provider, and I guess before I even get into that too, we could still even have a VPN connection, maybe as a tertiary type connection point off of this setup as well. But when we start to get really serious about our cloud deployments and what workloads we're actually running in there, utilizing these private lines and utilizing these private connections is going to allow us to get a lot better performance and latency more often than not when we have this setup. So, and on top of that as well, if we compare our final diagram or our last one where we see the most kind of HA and redundancy utilizing nothing but private lines compared to our VPN, you know, this is when we start to realize those cost savings and the benefits of using private lines, right? So in this internet VPN model, typically the egress fees for it are going to be around 8 or 9 cents a gig for all the information and all the data that you're pulling out of the cloud. So when you have light workloads, VPNs, and just starting to play around inside of these cloud providers, VPNs just make sense to me for the connection into it. It's going to be cost effective and easy. Once you start to have more and more workloads inside these cloud providers, the rest of your fees and those consumption pricing and those consumption costs are just going to start to increase as well. So when we start to leverage these private lines, now we're starting to save on those egress fees. So now we're only paying around 2 cents per gig for all of the data that we end up pulling out of the cloud providers. And so when we have a setup like this as well, I have it depicted as 2 connection points to the service provider, Megaport in this scenario. And so these 2 red physical ports, we can have separated on separate Megaport equipment as well. So that way there's actually no real single device points of failure in this setup. So not only are we connecting different customer edge routers to the service provider, we're also leveraging these different on-ramp devices. So that way, if any of these devices go down or anything like that, you won't have any single points of failure in the setup. And so in my mind, this is probably a reasonable amount of redundancy and HA capacity when you're going through and starting to think about how you want to leverage your workloads. Now, this is by no means the only way to do it, right? There's going to be a lot of different ways that you can end up building it out. It ultimately comes down to kind of a business decision of how much HA and redundancy do you actually need? Do you need more geographical disparity? Do you live in a place where maybe, you know, in California, for example, maybe there's a lot more earthquakes. Maybe you do want a little bit more geographical disparity. Maybe you don't need it. So a lot of that comes down to kind of a business decision and how much you actually need and how much you can afford. So when you start getting serious, and if you're on more of a kind of a budget restraint, I like this VPN with these private connections as the primary, VPNs as the backup. If the budget allows it and you need that performance when you do have a failover scenario, I really like to think about leveraging nothing but private connectivity for our primary and secondary, and maybe that tertiary option of utilizing those VPNs for this connectivity. And so today, how many of you guys are connecting to the cloud, whether it be via a direct line to the cloud providers, a service provider, or a VPN? What kind of models are you guys using? And feel free to you can just come off mute if you feel comfortable. You can message it in the chat, whatever anyone feels comfortable with. This is just about everything that I mostly wanted to talk through around these designs and these scenarios. So now I just want to leave it a little open for any questions or considerations or anything like that, that maybe I missed something. Maybe there's not a call out that I pointed out.
In the chat, we see one person responded they're using Citrix.
Using Citrix, nice. Nice. In what cloud providers are you using Citrix?
VDang, I don't know if you want to reply, but she's not the person's not quite sure.
Yeah. No, all good. All good. Yeah. And so I'm not super familiar with Citrix's offering. I think it largely has to do a lot with deploying virtual appliances inside of the cloud providers. So it's kind of abstracting a lot of that networking considerations, as I understand it, onto the actual virtual networking function or that Citrix virtual device to make those decisions. So all the VMs kind of end up routing through it. And so I really like using or that idea of using Citrix, because then it gives you a little bit more security inside the cloud provider if you're routing through another third-party device. When we start to utilize, these VPNs or these built-in offerings, one thing that does make it easier in terms of management and managing those different route tables and everything that you have to do is these are already baked in. So no need to do a lot of custom routing or a lot of custom setups to actually start utilizing kind of a setup like this. But it could also be integrated, and that you could use these private connection points and these private lines as an underlay for a Citrix deployment as well, or underlay for maybe you do need to route through a virtual firewall in AWS.
They added
you can
that
use
they're
this
new
for.
to it. They just added that they're new to the deployment. So they're pretty new in.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. And so with these different setups right now, I imagine it maybe your setup maybe looks something like this, where maybe you have those VPNs built off, maybe it's HA, maybe not, right? But what's neat about utilizing these direct connects express routes is that we'll get to utilize this, or could utilize this as an underlay as well. So instead of having to make all that traffic go over the public internet, now we're starting to leverage these private connections and get a little bit more built-in inherent security as well when we start to move over to kind of these more private models.
Hey, Kyle, so I do have a question for you. I mean, I'm on Megaport here, but the reality is you had 3 scenarios there. Are there some financial considerations that people should take into account of using 1 versus 2 versus 3 as far as the outlay or the potential what the company needs, right, to justify the expenditure? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I'm sure everyone here has to address that. And then I had another comment about another Citrix user, Citrix on Google Cloud. So just for your alignment.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I like the idea of talking a little bit about kind of the cost considerations, right? So truthfully, this is going to end up being the cheapest setup initially to start off, right? VPNs tend to not be just very expensive from these cloud providers to utilize our AWS and Azure and GCP VPNs. Now, where the break-even point starts to come into play is when we start having much more workloads utilizing these VPNs. And so I think typically the numbers that I've ran to justify the cost benefit of an Azure Express route at 1 gig, I think the break-even point is right around 10 to 15 terabytes a month to how much data is actually being used to start to realize some of these cost benefits of these private connections, along with the kind of the additional performance and the scalability and the elasticity of the bandwidth that you can create with them as well. So in terms of other cost considerations, right? So if we start to heavily utilize these VPNs, it starts going to get very pricey inside of our cloud providers. When we want to start realizing is the next progression in terms of cost, using a private connection point is going to be more expensive than using a VPN. However, you'll start to hit some of those break-even points if you start utilizing the cloud more so and start pulling a lot more data down. Utilizing that VPN, you'll just start to rack up a lot of charges. So it comes down to partially business decision, how much you're actually utilizing the cloud, how much you can afford. I think reasonable amount of performance mixed in with redundancy. I like the private connection with the VPN, cost budget permitting, utilizing these private lines for primary and backups. I would say this is a design for people who are very serious about their hybrid cloud strategy, heavily utilizing all of the clouds, and really need the performance that they'll get with these private lines. And so it almost changes from worrying about cost and more so worrying about performance. So initially, we're a little bit more worried about the cost considerations in our first 2 kind of setup. Like, hey, we want to keep this lower cost for us. We want to start to see some good performance. Now we care more about, hey, we need to start serving a lot more clients. Maybe we're pulling down a lot of data out of these clouds. Now we want to start to get better performance out of these circuits, and maybe we start to care a little bit less about what that cost ultimately looks like in terms of this setup. And so, really, once we get into utilizing these private connections, the cost isn't going to be anything super crazy, right? I think for a AWS 1 gig direct connect, I think it starts to cost out. I think it's like $400 a month. I believe I might have to double check that. It's actually been a while since I've taken a look. But the cost considerations aren't going to be that huge for just leveraging these models. I think a lot of the fees or a lot of the hidden fees is for those egress and transfer charges that I kind of start to see.
Thanks, Kyle. I hope that was helpful for the folks here. And again, this is your time. This is a workshop.
Yeah.
So if you have other questions you want to ask Kyle, he's one of the smartest, personally, I think one of the smartest SAs we have in our company. I like you, Kyle. But yeah, he's here to answer your questions. So feel free. It's your time.
If you guys like, I've actually been, and I'm an amateur singer, so I could just start singing a cool song for you guys. Just kidding. No one wants to hear me sing.
Everyone can hang out here, or if you want to pull back into the main room, you're free to do that too.
One big pitfall that we see, technical implementation problem that we see typically, is the public clouds have appropriately accounted for what they believe to be the most direct preferred route to a destination from a VPC or a security group, whatever the construct is, VLAN or network and GCP. The way that functions is if you have direct connection and it's learned a route over a direct connection, your VPC, or it gets more complicated here. There's a bunch of stuff in here that we don't have time to dig into today, but we can answer questions. You can contact Megaport guys, you can contact us, we'll walk you through it. But like there's virtual gateways and direct connect gateways and all kinds of like virtual services that are inside these boxes here. But the point is that there's route learning that's happening between your router or firewall and these gateway services. And that when Direct Connect, as an example, sees that route, it will always prefer it if it's available. Always. So that's what you want. This is actually what you want. The problem comes in on the other BGP connection. Typically the routing table and the way it processes routes in the router here. A lot of times you have to work with either us or your vendor to ensure that you properly configure this router VPN appliance to account for this preference and make sure that the traffic ultimately doesn't end up traversing outbound across your VPN and back to you from the public cloud direct connect over Megaport. And the crappy thing about this is that if you get it working incorrectly, it will a lot of times look like it's working, but it will provide you no availability. You will not have a backup technically. They're both required for the traffic to flow. And the way that you can test this is to do failovers, right? To cut off one of these circuits and make sure that bidirectional traffic still works, right? So test these connections, both sides, backup only, primary only, right? And that will show you that there's an issue there. Yeah, any questions? Don't be shy. Unmute, throw it in. No questions. All right. I know it's hard. I know not everybody, English is first language. I get it. We're all here together, but hopefully you're learning something, right? That matters. Let's see, we got some in the chat. Yeah, please use the chat if you want to throw some idea in there. But that's the major pitfall. And I think one thing that's worth talking about right here is the what you can expect as a benefit, the major benefits of using direct connectivity like Megaport. Top benefit in my mind is you have a network path that leverages private connectivity, like connectivity that was installed and designed specifically to not be for transit internet, the way that is basically handled. And that connectivity follows a very predictable route to the destination and on the physical side. And what that gives you is latency reduction, sometimes very significant latency reduction, right? And past latency reduction, it gives you consistency that you will not see using a VPN. If you were to track your latency across a VPN connection between your office or your data center and a public cloud over the VPN capability, over your public transit internet carrier, you will see inconsistency, significant at times. I'm talking like 15, 20 milliseconds potentially difference on a purely North America connection, leveraging this direct connectivity. Yeah, so I think that's it. Performance, consistency, and then I guess security, compliance as well. And like there's certainly a more private route. There's less prying eyes, potential prying eyes in the middle of these types of routes between your office and the public cloud. Last, your top level, fully redundant, right? Idea set around, and it's a very complex diagram, but ultimately getting from your office, your data center, and increasingly newer alternative cloud offerings like phoenixNAP's bare metal cloud, which is a data center as a service offering. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but getting from one of those sources to the public cloud in a extremely highly available production grade design can be complex, but this is way easier than it looks in a diagram in terms of it's also way easier than your other options that exist in the market. Because there are other options. You can use a traditional carrier, you can get direct connect from them, you can use your MPLS, you can do all these things are possible. It's just the time it takes you to implement and the commitment that you have to provide to the provider. These megaports are monthly. Their virtual circuits are hourly. Right? They can be, their speed can be changed instantly, right? So like there's so much agility that you get. I can create this, and I actually did a webinar with Google and Megaport. You can go look at, just go Google phoenixNAP, Megaport, Google. I did an implementation of this in Terraform that was like 5 minutes end to end, spinning up compute in bare metal cloud, spinning up compute in GCP, configuring all of the connectivity that's necessary to make this function, using Megaport's APIs to spin up virtual circuits, creating BGP sessions, everything end to end, 5 minutes. It's that composable. It's that easy. And you know, I think ultimately like the possibilities here around redundancy are immense, right? If you have multiple devices on your end, routers, firewalls, whatever you're using to do BGP and take that circuit, multiple cross connects, 2 minimally, 2 ports, 2 physical port allocations from Megaport, the ability to create virtual circuits on those interfaces that are not only multiple in nature, i.e. 2 virtual circuits. But optionally, and even more expansively, you can create this virtual circuit right here on the left for AWS in data center 1, this virtual circuit right here in data center 1, right? Connection partner data center number 1, because you can't really connect to AWS data centers. It's a complexity that we haven't talked about today, but like there's another data center on the other end that Amazon sits in or Google sits in, and that's where you connect to them. But let's say Amazon's physically present, Google's physically present in phoenixNAP's Phoenix location, right? They're physically there. You can create a virtual circuit to AWS Phoenix, another virtual circuit to AWS Phoenix, and then you could have a third virtual circuit in AWS connection at SuperNAP in Vegas. And you can provide resiliency and redundancy for these components, which are data center resident. You can provide redundancy for the ports themselves. And if you have multiple locations or multi-clouds, you can provide redundancy even from these connections here. You can become, and it doesn't cost as much as you think. Like, in Phoenix, we have some special rules for our customers in Phoenix because it's like our flagship data center, and we set some rules a long time ago, which, as a product guy, I'm like, okay, I have to live by these rules still. But so we don't charge you a monthly fee to connect to Megaport. phoenixNAP doesn't charge you a monthly fee to connect to Megaport. Megaport charges you a monthly fee for their port consumption, right? It's not very much. It's like $400 or $500, right, for the port. And then there's a nominal monthly fee or hourly technically, but monthly number fee for the virtual circuit. And as long as it's close in regionality, you're not transiting the world to Singapore or Amazon, you're talking about like $150, $100, something like that a month. So like this whole solution right here across 3 cloud providers, redundant ports, could be implemented for $1,500, $1,200 a month. Not saying that everybody needs this. It's certainly extremely redundant, but it is easy to configure. It is cost effective, and it is agile as hell, right? Like it can, like I said earlier, spin it up, spin it down, create capacity, actual connection capacity up and down, right? All kind of at the fingertips. And so like, I'm really excited about the things that we're doing as phoenixNAP with Megaport. We're going to talk a little bit more about those. And then I think, Devin, are you in here?
Yep, right in here, Will.
All right. I'm ready to go back. Is the other group, do you know yet if they're ready to go back?
Yeah, I think they should be. So let me go ahead and check with them real quick, and then we are going to go.
We're going to head back in
into
together, friends, and we're going to finish up this. I want to thank everyone for coming over here, trying this out, giving it a shot. If you hated this idea, please let us know in the feedback. If you thought it was imposing, but if you loved it, even if you didn't speak because it was just a little more intimate and we got a chance to talk about different things, let us know that too. Now that we're back together, I'm going to present my screen again so everybody can see it. Kyle, how was that? Was it? It was different, right?
Yeah, it was good. I like the idea of utilizing these smaller breakout rooms too. Though not a ton of involvement from the crew, it was just nice to be able to present to a smaller group of people as well. Had a couple people using some tricks on GCP, talking through a little bit of HA, what design and what progression kind of things look like, a few cost considerations when we're going through and starting to deploy these different hybrid cloud solutions. And so it's all good stuff.
Yeah, totally. Like I think that I talked a little bit about costing as well, and like even the architecture 3, how complex and crazy that looks, and like it doesn't really cost that much money. Like if you implemented that,
right? And no, it's funny that you mentioned that too. I started to talk about it, and then I couldn't remember the actual hourly charges, what it would cost for like an AWS Direct Connect. So, but no, you're right. Like the cost considerations aren't that much more When you start seriously playing around in these clouds, it's more of just going to be a smaller line item on your bill from the cloud provider at the end of the day, when compared to maybe some of the other costs that you're paying.
Oh, totally.
Things like that,
All your in public cloud, right? Like, I think I mentioned in my group, even architecture 3, a little bit cheaper in phoenixNAP's Phoenix data center, because we don't charge customers cross connects to get to Megaport.
Absolutely great call out. Yeah.
Yeah. But even in our other data centers, we don't have, we didn't agree to those terms 12 years ago with our customers. So we sticking to it, right? We're honoring everything that we said we would do. But even if you add in those extra fees for the cross connects from the data center, you got your Megaport fee, you got your direct connect fee, and you got a reasonable amount of capacity in a reasonably local sense, right? You're not going across the world to Singapore or Netherlands or whatever. $1,500, $2,000 probably maximum in there, for 100 meg, 200 meg.
No, and you're so right. I remember working a use case, probably just a couple months back. A customer of mine was working on migrating a petabyte, maybe 2 petabytes of data from the cloud back over to on-prem, because utilizing S3 for storage just got way too expensive for the customer. And they're like, there's more cost-effective solutions that don't exist in the cloud. So once they started going through the evaluation, if they had moved all of that data via a VPN, I think it ended up being like just over like $250,000 just to migrate all of that data down over a VPN. When we moved that to a private connection and ran the numbers, it ended up being around like 80,000 to actually move all of that data. So there was a lot of, wow, that's what we're going to be paying, this $2,000 a month or whatever it might be, is going to end up saving us thousands and thousands of dollars for this connection.
Absolutely. And the thing is like, people don't realize, they look at all this circuit, this port, this thing, like it all can be, in that use case you just described, ephemeral. It could be used just for that one thing, that one, project that you were working on right then at that moment on that day, right? Like I mentioned the webinar we did, we used Terraform and like made this connection happen in 5 minutes, spun up cloud resources.
And
right?
No, you're so right. And it's so great too, especially like, just being a cross connect away from you guys in phoenixNAP. Like after that, that's really just the longest temple, getting physically cross connected. Then thereafter, being able to spin up any of these connections kind of on the fly and as things change, makes it easy to be agile and light for the business. Yeah, totally. No, I think that's it. And what I wanted to transition to, we talked about all this network connectivity that you can just spin up on demand, right? Like, people tend to think that the public cloud and its capabilities are the only option. Like, I got 2 options today. The option 1 is I've got to do everything myself. I'm going to get my own servers, my own networks, my own storage, my own data center, co-location space. I'm gonna be like just doing it all, right? I've got to have skill sets. I got to have every skill set, right? And then my other option is I go to the public cloud and they're gonna do everything for me, potentially, depending on what service you're using, right? You can have literally everything from people realize like EC2 is a thing, people use it, but there's a lot of options for compute that are fully managed, completely serverless and all kinds of things like that, but they cost money and it's not cheap. A lot of money actually, right? Because AWS, Google, they're not dumb. They know they're replacing skill gaps. Right. They're replacing headcount. And you're paying a premium on that headcount. Like, because it's instantaneous and it's not, you don't have to architect it. You don't have to do any of these things, right? It's perfect. If you're a really small company that needs to just get up and rolling and you need to be out there right now with your app, by all means, public cloud, start there, move on, right? But what you'll realize over time is that, especially in the world that we live in today, there are so many options for infrastructure as a service that is not cloud locked, that is not
a specific service that owns your data, that if you don't use that API, that one API, you can't get your data back. There are options out there. And what we've been working with customers 3 years ago, 4 years ago, my team and I were sitting around thinking to ourselves, okay, like, we've been in the data center business for 10 years, 9 years at the time, co-location and the traditional data center services. We've been working on kind of niche enterprise cloud offerings where customers can like migrate their VMs. It's more like public cloud. You take your VMware machines and you move your VMs to another VMware cloud and you host them there, right? And while fine, right, you give up a lot of control to do that. It's just like public cloud, you give up a lot of control. Very portable, very easy to migrate from on-prem VMware to cloud-based VMware, but that you still lose a lot of control. But what could we do different, right? And so we said, well, what if we could make the data center, the things that people consume in the data center, the stuff that people move into colo, what if we could make those capabilities available instantaneously and on demand, right? So in our bare metal cloud offering, you can spin up physical dedicated servers attached to the network that is provided for you. You can create VLANs, you can make private networks, public networks, you can attach it to storage, you can build your own storage with other servers, right? Ceph and things like that. You've got all these options that are 100% dedicated to you, not multi-tenant. You have access to these compute systems just like you do on-prem, right? Think about being able to move into a new data center, spin up a VMware cluster that you, with your VMware licensing, without going into Dell and buying servers and waiting 8 months for the new servers to arrive because the supply chain. like this is possible. It's possible right now with the same cloud economics that you get in the public cloud, right? Like you can spin up these bare metal instances on demand via API, via Terraform, via Ansible, via UI, whatever you want to do. You can access them nearly identically to the way that you access them if you had racked them and stacked them yourself, right? Shell level, root level access to the bare metal machine, console level access to the bare metal machine. The only thing you can't do on those systems really and truly is like replace the BIOS or, microcontrollers and things like that on the board, right? That's it. You have access to everything else. If you want to, you like containers and you want to work on containers, but you're not ready to like move all your applications to public cloud, leverage our Rancher implementation. We call them solutions, but ultimately you can deploy fully production ready Rancher cluster in 5 minutes on dedicated machines that belong to you, that are the performance consistency of those applications are going to be perfect unless you make them not perfect, right? Like there's no multi-tenancy, there's no noisy neighbors, there's nothing like that. And for many, many comparable instance types, those dedicated instances are less expensive by a mile. Don't believe me? Go look, right? Like I'm talking, I think one of our cheaper instances that we would recommend for production is like 18 cents an hour, which is like $125. It has 64 gigs of RAM, a terabyte of NVMe attached storage, and 6 physical cores at 3.0 gigahertz apiece. Like that is a real horsepower machine that is not a virtual machine shared with other people, right? And if you tried to buy that same instance with that same profile in a public cloud by the hour, it would be 35 cents, 40 cents. Guarantee. I don't care what public cloud you go to, right? Because ultimately the job of the public cloud is to their mission of sorts is to not give you infrastructure as a service. It's to get you to consume their entire platform. And the economics early on that people saw, buy the server for $10,000, whether you know you want it or don't want it. Later, 6 months later, you still have the server, right? Versus, I'm going to go use this thing for 6 months and see if we need this for my application. It didn't matter that it was more expensive over the 36-month period. And believe me, like, I know a lot of people are probably thinking to myself, like, oh, well, if I go do a 36-month reservation in public cloud, it's a lot cheaper. Yeah, it is, but we have those too, right? So like, you know, this is not a public cloud bashing thing. We love our public cloud partners, and we love Megaport. Use public clouds, your like top partnership, pretty much, right? The major public clouds. Kyle, you know, and I think maybe you can provide some commentary here. It's, and you did earlier with that S3 example. It's not perfect for everything.
No, you know, and that's what I kind of like about, you know, you leveraging this multi-cloud strategy. It really allows you kind of build this best of breed. You know, some people like to think that all clouds were created equal. However, they are not, you know. So for like GCP, for example, you know, homegrown Kubernetes and just being able to run containerized instances inside GCP, no other provider, no other cloud provider, in my opinion, is going to be able to do as good of a job. Integration with Azure's Active Directory and O365 suite. Awesome, you know, but being able to leverage and just pick out all of the good from each of these different environments is going to be key to kind of, you know, maintaining and building this best of breed type deployment, and ultimately get you to be most efficient and kind of best performance for your kind of use case and your deployments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we'll run up towards the end of the hour, but we talked a little bit earlier about the common deployment opportunities. Kyle, maybe you could talk real quick about like which one of these you see the majority of people kind of looking towards.
Yeah, you know, truthfully, so I guess in this diagram, right, we see a couple different connectivity models. The one that I see most companies largely adopting, I think probably over the past year or so, is this bottom left quadrant where we have this hybrid multi-cloud type strategy and maybe have a few cloud to cloud workloads that need connectivity as well. So in that model, we leverage another service that we call the Megaport Cloud Router that specifically gets used for hybrid and multi-cloud use cases, and is a way to privately connect our different cloud providers together. So I think that one is probably the biggest one that I see more often than not. The newest, shiniest toy would be in the top right quadrant, where now we're bringing the power of the Megaport backbone of these private lines to an SD-WAN fabric and using it as this kind of SD-WAN underlay.
Yeah, agreed. No, definitely. I think that we see everybody kind of trying to get here, use multiple public clouds, put some things on-prem or in a data center as a service future like we talked about earlier. All right, the only poll question, the one we need you to interact with, and then I will give the Amazon gift card and we will get out of here. If you would like to know more about any of these things, it is multiple choice, right? Click the button. Like, we'll get the responses and we will not call you unless you want to learn something. If you want to learn more, we'll take it to another session, right? Private session. Maybe Kyle and I'll do one of these again in a few months or something like that. But based on these responses. But I want to tell you, we've gotten so many people in the chat saying, man, I love this format. I wish we could do more of this instead of just listening to like somebody ramble on about whatever product they like today, right? Certainly, both of us love our own products. Kyle loves Megaport. I love Megaport. I love our bare metal cloud product. I think it's the way of the future for a lot of people. I
love your bare metal cloud product.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think if everybody's good, let's get those answers in. We'll give it 15 more seconds and then we'll just shut it down. We'll show you the results so that everybody has data transparency. Don't make us look bad and have no responses, okay? I don't know what these responses look like. So click the button, please. All right. Devin, if you want to go ahead and close that up. All right. Cool. Perfect. Looks like we had the majority of people, connectivity configuration, virtual routing, multi-cloud, network management, a little bare metal cloud shout out there. Yeah, so I think that this is fantastic. This is exactly what we want to see. And with that, we will give away the gift card. And give me 1 second here. Let me get through the drawing. All right, Joshua Bernal. Joshua Bernal, you are the winner of the $100 Amazon gift card. We've done a lot of Q&As. We don't need Q&A time. Please, please, please send us your feedback at the end of this. Tell us you love this. Tell us you hated it. We want to do more of these things. We want to get more interactive with you guys. Thank you everyone for coming and spending an hour with us. And we will talk very, very soon.